Reese Air Force Base emerged from land that was once a cotton field. Now the base includes permanent facilities, high-tech aircraft, and state-of-the-art equipment. For the next few minutes, the Legacy Resource Management Program of the United States Department of Defense presents a brief view of Reese Air Force Base, its historic importance, and some of the people who lived there during the war years. The story of Reese Air Force Base begins with a look at a legendary West Texas city. Lubbock, located on the southern high plains of West Texas, was created from two nearby towns, Monterey and Old Lubbock, in 1891. The town grew slowly at first, then exploded in the 1920s when the city became the site for Texas Technological College in 1923. As early as 1932, the people of Lubbock had begun their effort to convince the War Department to build a U.S. Army Air Corps flying school in the area. The War Department's initial reaction to Lubbock's proposal was not favorable. The Lubbock Chamber of Commerce worked hard to secure its selection as the site for a flying school over the next 8 years. Influential friends were sought and favorable relationships cultivated. These contacts included local Congressman George Mahon and the leaders of aviation throughout America. Representatives from the Lubbock Chamber of Commerce went so far as to visit Air Corps officers in their hometowns. Hitler's rise to power and the formation of the Axis alliance led President Roosevelt to propose spending $300 million on the expansion of Air Corps personnel training and the construction of new air bases. Because of this, the Air Corps suggested in October 1940 that Lubbock begin a search for tracts of land that might be suitable for an aviation training school. The land that ultimately would become Reese Air Force Base was purchased from the J.D. Lindsay estate. The city paid the Lindsay estate $50,000, or $35 an acre, for roughly 1,400 acres. Lubbock then offered the deed to the government for $1 a year. In early June 1941, Congressman George Mahon announced in a telegram that Lubbock had been selected to be the site of a new flying school. On June 23, 1941, the school was officially designated the Air Corps Advanced Flying School. The formal award of the construction contract was made in Washington, D.C. on August 22, 1941, and work was scheduled to be completed within 120 days. The original authorized cost of the base was $5.2 million. The contract provided for the construction of an entire Air Corps station. The installation covered 1,651 acres. On August 23, 1941, the first cadre of 5 enlisted men arrived from Brooksfield, Texas, to help with the administration duties connected with the construction of the new field. The first commander of the airfield was Major Herbert M. Newstrom, and by November 19, 1941, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas L. Gilbert had assumed command of the airfield. W.G. McMillan of Lubbock was awarded one of the subcontracts. McMillan was also an avid filmmaker who documented the construction of the base. At the peak of construction, 1,600 men were employed on the project. Among these men was the son of W.G. McMillan, 14-year-old W.G. McMillan, Jr. His job was to move freshly mixed concrete.
You had a crew on the foundations, you had a crew on the floor assembly, the joist, and the decking. You had a crew of men that would lay out all the walls and put the windows where they needed to go. It had to be done that way because you couldn't take one building and completely build it. You had to keep going and get ahead of it. But that's the only way that they were able to meet the schedule. Most all of the men that I got to know were eager to do their job. And the whistle blew. They didn't drop everything right then. They still finished what they were doing. We took pride and we said our prayers in school, and we made our pledges to allegiance. And none of us realized that we eventually would be in the service. I didn't.
The routine sounds of construction changed in December 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought about the United States' involvement in World War II. Suddenly, the completion of the Lubbock Flying School became vital. Crews worked through the holidays with no days off, and construction was completed well ahead of schedule. In February 1942, the school was designated the Lubbock Army Flying School. and the field was officially dedicated June 21st, 1942. Gordon Treadaway, who was assigned to military intelligence, was among those reporting for duty for the first time that day.
Well, I was here when the day the base was formally opened, June the 21st, 1942. They had a formal program. General Harmon from the Gulf Coast Flying Training Command made the main speech, and it's estimated by the newspapers at least 30,000 attended that open house. Even from the beginning, the people of Lubbock had been most supportive of the military and Lubbock Army Airfield.
The first group of cadets arrived on February 25th, 1942. Planned training for pilots was a three-pronged assignment: primary, basic, and advanced. Lubbock was one of the country's advanced flying schools. Students finished with 200 hours of flying time, spending half of each day in flight and half in ground school. Cadets also learned to fly blind using only instruments. Retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Owen Clark was in the first class of enlisted pilots to graduate from Lubbock.
The roadways and streets haven't changed that much. The buildings, a lot of changes in the buildings. Back in 42, all the buildings were temporary. This one we're in right now is the type of barracks we lived in. No permanent structures. The flight line still looks the same. The hangars, the same hangars that are there today were the hangars in 1942.
Although the primary mission of the airfield was to train pilots in the operation of twin-engine airplanes, early training was undertaken in the single-engine North American AT-6 Texan. The reasons for this lay in the accelerated pace of preparing to fight in the war and the scarcity of the new twin-engine aircraft. By the time the third class of cadets arrived, twin-engine planes such as the AT-17, UC-78, and the AT-9 had arrived and were being used for training. Perry Bell was in the first class of officer pilots to graduate from the airfield.
You learned training over and over and over to learn to fly the airplane visually as well as blind. You fly with the instructor for a minimum of 8 hours. And then when he thinks that you are ready to fly the airplane alone, he takes you through all the maneuvers necessary. He opens the canopy and gets out and says, okay, it's yours, take it and fly it. From the time I said I do till graduation, April the 29th, 1942, 7 months and 2 days. In that time, I learned to be a soldier, an officer, and a pilot.
The first class was presented with silver wings and gold bars during a morning graduation ceremony on April 29, 1942. From Lubbock, the cadets, commissioned as second lieutenants, were sent to various bases around the country.
And in my own particular case, within 30 days after graduation, I was in a potential war zone, Alaska.
Although Perry Bell had trained on the single-engine AT-6, he was assigned to the twin-engine single-seat P-38. College-educated cadets like Perry Bell were not the only men trained to become pilots at the installation during the Second World War. The sergeant pilot program allowed men with little or no college education to enlist in the U.S. Army and to become pilots in the Air Corps. However, since they did not have 2 years of college, they were graduated from their training not as second lieutenants, but as staff sergeant pilots. Owen Clark, a member of the first class of enlisted pilots at Lubbock, began his training in August 1941 and ultimately rose from sergeant to the rank of lieutenant colonel.
And most of us old GIs who went into that sergeant or enlisted pilot training program wanted to fly. We didn't really care a lot about rank at that point in our careers. We just wanted to fly.
This innovative program helped provide America with the pilots desperately needed for the war effort. From August 1942 until July 1943, the airfield served as a pool from which glider pilots were chosen to be trained. The mission of glider pilots was to silently land people behind enemy lines. Instruction took place at the nearby South Plains Army Airfield. This facility was located at present-day Lubbock International Airport. On April 26, 1943, the school was redesignated Lubbock Army Airfield. During this period, the average number of military personnel at the airfield was 4,600. June 1943 marked the arrival of the first participants in the Women's Army Corps, known as WACS. This was 13 months after Congress established the Corps as an auxiliary service. There were between 75 and 85 WACs stationed at the airfield. The WAC's assignment was to relieve Air Corps personnel who were needed at the battlefront. Another program was created that permitted women to serve their country in a very different way, as pilots. The Women Air Force Service pilots, known as WASPs, came into being on August 5, 1943. The first of these pilots arrived at the Lubbock Army Airfield on August 17, 1944. From that time until the deactivation of the program, there were 10 WASPs assigned to Lubbock Army Airfield, where approximately 800 women served nationally. The commanding officer of the program, Jacqueline Cochran, specifically directed that WASPs not be used for secretarial work. The WASP's duties held many dangers. Bonnie Shinsky, who served as a WASP at Lubbock, recalls.
There was a chaplain that was very anxious to get to Randolph Field, and would I take him? And I said, sure, I had a spare chute. Be glad to take him. And I don't think I'd ever been in a plane, let alone with a woman pilot. I think I was just taxiing out to take off when he got out the prayers. He was just so nervous, and I had to fly instruments. It was terrible weather, just awful. He was just praying the whole time. Well, I was nervous enough, you know, with the conditions, but with him, oh, I landed finally at Randolph Field, and I put the hatchback, and he just got up, and he walked toward the sunset. He never said thank you, goodbye. I never saw him again.
Although WASPs were trained civilian pilots, many of their male counterparts considered them to be unqualified. This prejudice kept the WASP program at a low profile. Some in the military did not even know that the WASP program existed. The WASPs wanted to be awarded military status and later veterans benefits. But whether they should be incorporated into the WACs or become their own separate corps clouded the issue. Before this could be resolved, the WASP program was deactivated on December 20th, 1944. Along with the WASPs stationed at the airbase, African-American troops also served. Rudolph Belvin reported for duty on February 22nd, 1943.
My rank was private from the time I arrived until the time I left. My duties was KP for a while, then I was reassigned to transportation. And after that, I was assigned to field maintenance.
In the 1940s, the base was racially segregated. The African-American troops numbered about 200. All were enlisted men. None were officers.
That's what we were brought in service for, to serve the white soldiers.
Most African-Americans with dependents lived off base in a segregated section of Lubbock known as the Flats, or Carver Heights, in less than adequate housing. Segregated sections were patrolled by African-American military police. African-Americans also participated in the education program. This provided academic enrichment where society had failed to do so.
On the base, we were allowed two streets. We were allowed one street coming up straight up to the theater. We'd come up that street, go to the theater, go back. When we came out of the theater, we had to go back. We had our own PX. If we go into town, we had to come around the southeast side and come up the gate, catch the bus, and that's when we got off the bus. That's where we got off the bus and had to go back around the same way. The time that I was here, I wouldn't regret it. I wouldn't change the experience for nothing.
Another aspect of the installation was its use as a branch prisoner of war camp. The first prisoners, a group of 65 Germans, arrived on March 4th, 1945. By June, the number had increased to a total of 236. By early August, the Germans had been transferred and replaced by Italian prisoners.
As I recall, most of the POWs who were stationed here were Germans, primarily from General Irwin Rommel's elite Africa Corps. These were highly professional, highly trained soldiers. They were given an opportunity, they weren't forced to, but they were given an opportunity to get out and go down into the south and southeast part of Lubbock, where the cotton oil mills were. They would ride in open trucks right straight down 19th Street in the middle of town.
In December 1945, it was announced that the POW camp would close at the end of January 1946. Orders for base inactivation were received in November 1945, and on the last day of December 1945, the airfield was closed as a training facility. It was placed on standby status as a sub-base of San Angelo's Goodfellow Field. Throughout the war years, the airfield carried out its training mission, and by 1945, had graduated 7,008 new pilots. As the last class completed flight training on October 25, 1945, the primary mission of Lubbock Army Airfield was also completed. As Cold War tensions intensified during the late 1940s and early 1950s, some installations were reactivated. Among those called back into duty was the facility at Lubbock. Upon reactivation on August 1, 1949, the facility was renamed Reese Air Force Base in honor of local airman Augustus F. Reese. Lieutenant Reese was from Shallowater, a nearby town. He graduated from Texas Technological College in 1939. First Lieutenant Reese was killed in action at Cagliari, Sardinia, Italy, while flying a volunteer mission. The field was formally renamed Reese Air Force Base in dedication ceremonies on January 22, 1950. All that remains of the World War II era at Reese Air Force Base are a few buildings and part of the original runway layout. Since World War II, many of the original temporary buildings and structures have been replaced with permanent facilities. This has been the fate of all but a few of Reese's World War II era buildings. Those that remain are presently slated for eventual disposal. Soon, none of the buildings representing the war era will remain on base. Many of the original structures purchased by local businessmen to house their businesses have been moved off base and can now be seen throughout the Lubbock area. The removal of these structures from their original context at the airfield has effectively removed them from consideration as historic properties eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places. As part of its responsibilities under the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, as amended, Reese Air Force Base has surveyed the World War II structures and submitted their findings to the State Historic Preservation Officer. The current mission of Reese Air Force Base is to train the best military pilots with the greatest efficiency and the least cost. The T-1A, T-37, and T-38 now fly in the West Texas skies from Reese Air Force Base. Although the WASP program is no more, women in the military have achieved the goals of the WASPs. On April 28, 1993, the Department of Defense announced that the combat exclusion law was lifted. Today, as a result, women are flying combat aircraft. And the WASPs have been given long overdue military status and benefits. In addition, African Americans enjoy equal status in the military. Reese Air Force Base has kept pace with advancing flight technology and continues to be a significant facility in the overall United States military program. Maintenance of our national defense capabilities and conservation of our resources are continuing responsibilities for the United States Air Force. The Legacy Resource Management Program responds to the challenge of integrating these two missions. Legacy demonstration projects set new standards for protection and provide new methods and technology to ensure a future for resources of the past. This program is made possible by support from the Department of Defense Legacy Resource Management Program.